On introduction, please. Thank you.
Yes, the honourable member for Halifax Bedford based on introduction.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to introduce in the East Gallery Irene Swindells, who's the National Vice President of the Progressive Conservative Party of Canada, who's joined us this evening. Irene, would you rise and receive the welcome of the House, please?
Thank you. We welcome Irene to the gallery this evening. The honourable member for Cape Breton West, thank you, and you have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I, too, welcome the special guest for the member for Halifax Bedford Basin. Mr. Speaker, there are a number of issues that this bill that I have to bring before the Minister and the House here this evening. First and foremost is the question as to whether we should even be having this bill before the House. Not in any way to diminish the merits of what the bill has to offer, but rather, if the Minister were to check with the existing Workers' Compensation Act, Chapter 10 of the Acts of 1994-95, Mr. Speaker, which was subsequently amended. But under Part 1, referred to as Workers' Compensation, Scope, application of Part 1, Mr. Speaker, Section 3, subsection 1 and 2, and I'll quote for the Minister's benefit. This part applies to employers and workers engaged in, about, or in connection with any industry prescribed by the Governor and Council by regulation. In subsection 2, the Governor and Council may by regulation exclude any employer, class of worker engaged in, about, or in connection with any industry prescribed pursuant to subsection 1. Well, Mr. Speaker, if you take that section of the Workers' Compensation Act, and if you were to go and look at the regulations to the Workers' Compensation Act, well, Mr. Speaker, I can't even hear myself, let alone yourself when you intervene. And I can't proceed unless I get some silence of some sort here.
Order, please. The honourable member for Cape Breton West has the floor. I would ask everyone to give the same respect that he does to the other people when they're speaking it.
Mr. Speaker, I can see why you're in the chair. And it's just that I feel it's somewhat technical and detailed, and the Minister is trying to listen with his earpiece, and he's struggling to hear what I'm saying. And I don't think I'm that quiet. I could, raise the tone slightly if he needs. He says he's deaf. Well, he's probably deaf to what some of the stakeholders are saying on this bill as well. Because, Mr. Speaker, if you look at the exemptions to the regulations specifically exclude police officers and firefighters for the province. All it would take is for the Governor and Council, the Cabinet, to go downstairs, amend the regulations to include fire departments and/or police departments. And then, Mr. Speaker, the Minister could direct the board to develop the policy surrounding this entire issue. And I'm sure the member for Cole Harbour Eastern Passage may have some insights on this as well, having worked within the workers' compensation system. Mr. Speaker, the question I would ask is, what consultation did the Minister have with the board, the Workers' Compensation Board? What directive or what information did he have aside from perhaps a discussion with the chairman of the board? I understand that the board will be meeting on Wednesday of this week to deliberate on this very issue. But wouldn't it have been better to have the deliberations prior to the introduction of this bill to involve the stakeholders? Would it not have been better, Mr. Speaker, had we some insight from the Workers' Compensation Board, the chairman of the board, perhaps and the Chief Executive Officer, Chief Financial Officer, I believe, should come before law amendments to give an explanation of the detail that they see to this particular piece of legislation. Now, that having been said, Mr. Speaker, it wouldn't take much for the minister to call Huey or Louie and Stewie. I think that's their names. Louie and Stewie. They can bring Huey and Dewey if they like. But the fact of the matter is, we haven't seen any input from the board, which represents both industry and labor, Mr. Speaker, and again, representatives from the government, the general public at large. And I think that's very unfortunate. I somehow can't help but think that perhaps the minister rushed with this because he was afraid the NDP was going to get some credit in rural Nova Scotia for introduction of their bill. And quite frankly, I don't care who gets the credit. I really don't. As long as we do something to help volunteer firefighters. And isn't that what we're here for? And it seemed like a rather impetuous move by the government to do what was done in such short notice. Now, Mr. Speaker, the government says it's only good for volunteer firefighters or paid firefighters if they contribute to the workers' compensation system. In other words, if there's premiums being paid by either the local municipality or the volunteer fire department or what have you. But if they don't pay into it, they're out in the cold. And by the minister's own admission, 3,000 volunteer firefighters will get absolutely nothing. They will get nothing by this piece of legislation. Now, I understand, Mr. Speaker, what the minister is trying to do is to go on a similar parallel to automatic assumption as with black lung disease in the coal miners. But, Mr. Speaker, by his own admission, the medical experts at the board will still have to review the evidence. And my colleague from Cole Harbour, Eastern Passage, knows what can happen there. So what's the time frame? All the more reason to see these preliminary regulations, these draft regulations. As well, Mr. Speaker, I believe the minister has to give some clarity on how this will either be integrated or not integrated with the functional restoration program with the board. So by the time you get through all these hoops, Mr. Speaker, and then look at the fact, for example, CBRM, perhaps Truro, Lunenburg, maybe a few of these municipalities that pay into the workers' compensation system on behalf of their volunteer firefighters, they essentially have coverage now. The minister's saying, well, we're going to cut through all the red tape and make it easier for them. Well, that can be done by regulation and policy of the board. If anyone were to look at the policy manuals of that board, it's enough to spin your head for 3 years to figure out, you know, some of the detail on various issues and illnesses that injured workers are dealing with when they apply for compensation. Very little. The empowerment is there, I would submit. And hopefully maybe one of our legal minds that are on the floor of the legislature here may be able to offer better insight. But the bill seems rather obvious to me, Mr. Speaker. The existing legislation deals with it. So why bother? It was simply to get out and get public relations. And the media reports were government providing compensation for firefighters, and they focused on volunteer firefighters, for certain illnesses, cancers and so on. Well, that's great. But the fact of the matter is, if you can determine the cause and effect relationship, you're receiving it anyway. You're going to receive it. So if the issue of presumption is what the minister is trying to cut through to compete with the NDP, then I think he's ill-advised. somebody gave bad political advice. This is a political document. Now, if it doesn't take away from the volunteer firefighters, Mr. Speaker, pass it or don't pass it. The fact of the matter is, you can achieve the same goal by regulation and policy. Why isn't the government going that extra step for the 3,000 volunteer firefighters across rural Nova Scotia, with more than half the volunteer fire departments in this province getting nothing, absolutely nothing from this government? So much for the great brand billing that this minister and this government put out for volunteer firefighters. They aren't getting anything. And that's the disappointment, Mr. Speaker. And let's look at some of the others. Let's look at some of the others. Look at Halifax Regional Municipality. They don't pay into the workers' compensation system because they have what they feel is their own private insurance program, compensation program. A self-insurance program. So none of the Halifax regional firefighters will see any benefit to this particular piece of legislation. Now, what about employers that give time off to their employees to go and engage in fighting a fire? Mr. Speaker, again, those employers will be paying for this volunteer service. So, where does the government come in? The only thing we've seen the government come in so far is to try and scramble to get a good public relations exercise out there going into an election. Great. If that's what they want, fine and dandy. I'm only here to get protection for those volunteer firefighters who aren't going to get protection. And I think the government owes that, Mr. Speaker. When you look, Mr. Speaker, at the millions, the hundreds of millions of dollars that volunteer firefighters save for the people of Nova Scotia, for municipalities, for the province, for industry, for the insurance companies. This here report, well, this one is almost 5 years old, and it's close to $250 million in the 10-year period. That's just what volunteer firefighters did. And that's not a complete report. They get it, they get that information by the submissions of information that come in from the various volunteer fire departments. We have approximately 315 volunteer fire departments, which the minister says only about half are going to get coverage. Why a half measure? Why not do it and do it right, Mr. Speaker? Why isn't the government going to some of these multilateral corporations that are saving hundreds of millions of dollars and still increasing insurance premiums for householders, car owners, and businesses across Nova Scotia? They're almost doubling the insurance premiums, and the government is collecting a hidden tax, and still, who's doing the dirty work? The volunteer firefighters, who get no protection from this government. Mr. Speaker, I say shame. Between life insurance, automobile, and home insurance, hidden taxes, this government this year will collect $48.5 million this year. And how much of that is coming on the backs of volunteer firefighters? I dare say a fair bit. Mr. Speaker, if the government wanted to do something, get past the facade of trying to take credit and take ownership in such a paternalistic fashion, as if volunteer fire departments will become ingratiated by this action and beholding to this government, when in fact, more than half of them, really, when you add up the ones with HRM and the other ones that are going through the private insurance scheme, more than half of them will see little or no benefit. Mr. Speaker. And why isn't the government doing something that? If, in the absence of those that are exempted out of the plan, let's say 4,500, or 5,000 if the minister wants to include the paid service. Let's assume, for the sake of discussion, if you took the 8,000 and bunched them all together in one envelope, and you took the total cost of the compensation for the 8,000 across this province, I dare say you'd be looking at somewhere in the vicinity of about $800,000. Mr. Speaker, is that a lot to ask the various stakeholders? Municipalities, I'm sure, would be a willing partner to share some of that 800,000. Surely the heavens, the insurance industry should be able to. How many times do you see the insurance industry line up and make contributions to volunteer firefighters in rural Nova Scotia? Not too often. Maybe they do, and I'm sure in some cases they do. But when you consider the millions and millions of dollars, the tens of millions of dollars that are taken out of these communities on the backs of these volunteer firefighters, it pales in comparison. It pales. And then what about the government? What's the government doing? Besides legislating a further burden on the private sector and downloading more on the municipality. If that's the argument the minister wants to use, that it's only if they pay into it, well, what's the government going to pay into it? You know, Mr. Speaker, when we were on that side of the House and we introduced the Workers' Compensation Board Act, the amendments in 1999, spring of 99, the Conservative caucus said that it was not fair to the employers of this province to be paying 100% of the cost of occupational health and safety training. So what did we do? There was a compromise. That's essentially what it was. It was an 85-55% split. Yes, it was a minority government, Mr. Speaker. Indeed it was. But as soon as the government got in power, what did they do? They pumped that up to 91%. You know, they stuck it to the very people they said they were going to champion a cause for. And why is that issue important to this, Mr. Speaker? It's because volunteer firefighters, as well as paid service, they have to receive that training in order to be operational, Mr. Speaker, in order for them to receive insurance. And I think that's not fair, what the government is doing. It's patently unfair. Is there anything inherently negative with this particular piece of legislation? One could argue no. Every one you help is one less you worry about. And that's a good thing, because that's what we're here for. But, Mr. Speaker, I'm disappointed. I'm disappointed that we've missed an opportunity. Maybe when it goes to law amendments, we will have an opportunity. Mr. Speaker, you have volunteer fire departments in your riding. Maybe the town of Spring Hill covers them. Maybe Amherst. Well, I think your colleague covers the Amherst area. But Parsbro, like my former colleague would say, Parsbro, Lower River Hibbard, and all these names that we always, Joggins, and so on and so forth. He used to name them with great clarity and persistence, because, Mr. Speaker, that was the good part about it. Here we had a champion of rural Nova Scotia. And I sense the government is only creating a facade, an image of wanting to help volunteer firefighters in rural Nova Scotia. They represent 2/3 of the population, Mr. Speaker. So why isn't the government doing something else for them? Mr. Speaker, I would be very interested in having David Stewie and Louis Comeau come down and give us some detail and explanation. And the costing of this particular piece of legislation. The minister said that it would only cost about $200,000 a year. Well, why wouldn't it? He's excluded the best part of all of the volunteer firefighters in the province. And by his own figures, Mr. Speaker, I would submit, Mr. Speaker, that he's wrong, that it would only cost $200,000 a year in payouts. It would cost more. So, Mr. Speaker, I'm a little at a loss to why the minister is doing what he's doing. He's saying, well, if the municipality will pay for the premiums or the volunteer fire departments can raise the money, they can pay in. Has anyone had a reality check lately in rural Nova Scotia about how hard it is for volunteer fire departments to exist, to continue? Remember down in Colchester County there less than 2 years ago when they were talking about packing in one of the volunteer fire departments because they couldn't get volunteers? I'm sure if we went down to Digby or Annapolis or some of those, Mr. Speaker, those areas, we would find that the government is letting them down. And Mr. Speaker, with all the downloading on the municipality, you can't expect the municipal units to do it all either. They just don't have the money. The government already downloaded the equivalent of, for some municipality, a 5% property tax increase by downloading the cost of education in this budget. And now they're expecting to download further costs for fire departments. What is the government doing? What is the government doing in all this? They claw back somewhere in the vicinity of $4 million a year from the Workers' Compensation Board. What are they doing with it? Why aren't they, Mr. Speaker, helping volunteer firefighters in this province? Mr. Speaker, we'll recall in March of 2002, a gentleman by the name of Mr. Dorsey provided a report for the government. It was essentially, Mr. Speaker, a review of the workers' compensation program in Nova Scotia. Now, aside from the issue of supplemental benefits that the government provided, no other recommendations have been acted on. The government has not said so, but the costing of these recommendations would be somewhere in excess of $240 million. Maybe that's why the government doesn't want to deal with these issues right now, because there's an election. Maybe, Mr. Speaker, it's because the investments at the Workers' Compensation Board are not working out as well as they would have liked. Mr. Speaker, when we were in government, the unfunded liability and the plan to pay it down was very effective. And at the rate we were going, we would have had a 40-year debt. That's what it was amortized over. Paid off in 16 years. And when this government came in, what happened? Start to slow down. Slow down. Indeed it did. Work out the percentages. I know the minister is kind of itching to get into the debate, and I'd welcome any comments from the minister on this particular issue. Mr. Speaker, it would take very little, to help those firefighters across this province, whether they be down in Canso, anywheres in Guysborough. Mr. Speaker, what about all the Tory backbenchers that are sitting there quietly, and not one volunteer fire department in their area will see a benefit from this act? Not one, unless they pay in through the municipality, the system. So what about those that can't afford it? You know, the cost of the additional occupational health and safety training is the equivalent of what a volunteer fire department would pay in workers' compensation premiums in the run of a year. Depending upon the size, could be looking at anywhere from $1,500 to $2,500. And anyone that has worked with a volunteer fire department would know what I'm saying. Mr. Speaker, I'm hoping that the minister would be good enough before we're finished debating, when he closes debate for second reading, that he would be willing to stand in this place and acknowledge that the government is willing to do something for the other 50% of all the fire departments in this province. Do something for these 3,000 volunteer firefighters. Mr. Speaker, it would be interesting to hear the costing from our Chief Financial Officer from the board, and I would encourage the minister to make a formal request to the chairman of the board and to the Chief Financial Officer, Louis and Stewie, have them come down before law amendments and explain what the cost of this particular piece of legislation will mean. Mr. Speaker, because if they're only going to meet on Wednesday of this week, obviously they haven't had a chance to digest and analyze and prepare. And how can you prepare policy when you don't even have the regulations? The minister says he only has draft regulations. And when's this going to come into effect? After the election? Well, what a coincidence. Maybe they don't proclaim it. You can proclaim the act, but if you don't have the regulations, it's of no value. Because we know the act only sets out the principles and the direction and the general issues that you would like to achieve, and the regulations are the working component. That's what makes it happen, Mr. Speaker. I think the minister should, as we did, Mr. Speaker, when I was Minister of Labour, we tabled those draft regulations. We tabled them for all members of the House to digest and analyze and come back with a constructive criticism or analyzation and hopefully a resolve to improve. Minority, majority, whatever, Mr. Speaker. You know, the NDP, they wanted the regulations, they got them. You know, they can't say that we weren't cooperative and we weren't willing. You know, Mr. Speaker, this whole issue surrounding volunteer firefighters, it's a little more complex than just saying we're going to provide a benefit. And then when you start reading the detail, and more than half of them are excluded, you know, get a reality check, because the rest are already covered in the system. And really what the minister is saying, what we will do is bring in that assumption factor so as to dispense with all the red tape, all the loopholes that people have to go through for medical evidence. But are they going to bypass the medical experts altogether? Or do volunteer firefighters have to have that disease for X number of years before they can receive any compensation, similar to coal miners? And I believe the figure there is 20 years. But Mr. Speaker, if you're a volunteer firefighter, you may not be able to go back to your full-time job because of this here. So what's the time frame? What are the parameters that the minister is talking about? And yes, I'm very concerned about this functional restoration program. If they're going to bypass that, the minister has an obligation to say that, because it could have a dramatic impact, Mr. Speaker, as to what the level of income will be. The minister goes on, you know, and waxes eloquence about, you know, the low end of the scale is about 10,400, and I'm just paraphrasing numbers, may not be exactly, but it's within a couple $100, up to about 41,000. And then, man, once he uses the figure 41,000, that's the figure he runs with, to try and make every volunteer firefighter believe psychologically that they're going to receive $41,000. Well, that's hogwash, Mr. Speaker. That's absolute hogwash, and he knows it, and the government knows it. I would like to see, if the government is very dogged on this, if they're so determined to eclipse the NDP for what they were proposing, and you know, if they think that'll achieve the same goal, then so be it. Mr. Speaker, I would advocate that the government has to shift the focus of this particular piece of legislation substantially. Yes, if this issue of automatic assumption will improve or streamline the process to make it easier for those that are already in the system, so be it. Even though clearly I believe it can be done by regulation and policy at the board, because the board ultimately is the one that's going to have to do the detail on this, Mr. Speaker. But another asset to this particular piece of legislation would be, and if the minister is so inclined, he can introduce an amendment himself. Or, Mr. Speaker, we could introduce an amendment, you know, that would require the government to take the initiative, to take the action, to provide coverage for the 3,000 volunteer firefighters in this province that get absolutely nothing. There's no benefit in this bill for them. They may go out, they may get, just because they don't pay compensation, or the municipality or the fire department doesn't pay workers' compensation premiums, doesn't mean to say that they don't inhale smoke at a fire like those that do. They're just as susceptible to illness and disease from inhaling all these toxic fumes as those that do receive coverage. So, Mr. Speaker, there's an opportunity here for the government to save some face, too. Improve the bill. And, Mr. Speaker, I would hope that the minister would take an opportunity to reflect on that over the next day or so, because I know there'll be some of my colleagues, both in our caucus and the NDP caucus, who will want to expand on this considerably, because I don't want to lose an opportunity to help volunteer firefighters, Mr. Speaker. You know, back in 1999, when we had the budget that was defeated, and that's fair, that's a democratic process, but in that, you know, I'd worked very hard to bring that issue forth for license plates for volunteer firefighters. And I was pleased to see that the government didn't take it out of the budget in the fall of that year. But that's only a small step. It was only a small step. Here's an opportunity for this government and for all members of this legislature to make a real difference, for those volunteer fire departments who don't have the benefit. Well, the minister during estimates suggested that they could go out, they raise their own money. They're struggling just to keep the lights on, some of them. And yet they have to go around, Mr. Speaker, and be on ready alert. It doesn't matter whether it's 2 in the morning or 2 in the afternoon. They have to be there, and they're always upgrading the training, Mr. Speaker. You know, it's amazing how many firefighters in volunteer fire departments of this province have received their level 1 training. Another program that we had introduced, Mr. Speaker, when I was minister, was the educational program that would enable both volunteer and paid service firefighters from any jurisdiction to be able to come to Nova Scotia and complete the training program that was laid out by the fire school and the fire marshal's office, and it met not just national but international standards. And that brought the level of professional training and expertise for volunteer firefighters of this province to be able to apply for and receive opportunities in the full-time paid fire service, whether it be in Nova Scotia, New Brunswick, or British Columbia, or what have you, Mr. Speaker. And I believe we were one of the first in the country to do it. I would also like to hear the fire marshal come down before law amendments. Hear what the fire marshal has to say about this. Mr. Speaker, recent amendments to the Municipal Government Act, or to the, I forget what the name of the act, the Fire Prevention Act, the new Fire Prevention Act from last year. That enabled municipalities to take greater control of their destiny at the local level. But what it also did, Mr. Speaker, is allow that government to download cost on municipalities and volunteer fire departments. Not too much was said about that. There's not too much fanfare about that. You know, the minister and the government couldn't wait to run out and tell the people of Nova Scotia that they were getting this special benefit for volunteer firefighters across Nova Scotia. That's not entirely true. It's not entirely true, Mr. Speaker. So if you put all these packages together...
Order, please. The honourable member for Cape Breton West has the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I have the attention of one very concerned member, and I do appreciate your indulgence. I think, Mr. Speaker, I've made many of the points that speak to this particular issue. I can only implore the government to really give some serious consideration to amending this bill to address the needs of volunteer firefighters, particularly in rural Nova Scotia. Mr. Speaker, look at the population trends. They're working against volunteer firefighters. The average age level in some of these volunteer fire departments has increased significantly. Why? Because the younger men and women in rural Nova Scotia are finding it increasingly difficult to commit to the amount of time required to provide this service. Mr. Speaker, they go out. I can point out out of the 14 volunteer fire departments in my constituency, they are raising money almost 7 days of the week, whenever they can. You know, whether it be lobster dinners, whether it's flea markets, whether it's bingos, or what have you, Mr. Speaker. And it's getting increasingly difficult to make those things happen. The capital cost of operating, Mr. Speaker. You know, one time the government had the Little Red Schoolhouse program to be able to assist on certain community-based facilities. And that's been changed somewhat. But, you know, there are some volunteer fire departments that are having trouble even being able to raise money to be able to repair the roofs and the windows in their complexes. If we continue at the rate we're going, Mr. Speaker, there'll be further centralization, and there'll be closure of some of these volunteer firefighters, fire departments. And, Mr. Speaker, I had the good pleasure of attending some of the hearings in your particular jurisdiction several years ago, and I was quite impressed. For a small community, a community that was hard hit over the years, you know, with the closure of the coal mining industry, and it's a little off the beaten trail in terms of Trans-Canada, and I was really impressed with how committed and how dedicated they were to fighting fires and the issue of fire protection in your community, and probably a number of communities there. And one only has to sit down and listen to some of the stories that they'll tell you when you go to visit them, Mr. Speaker. And I'm worried because if we don't protect these volunteer fire departments, the cost to individual homeowners, the cost to industry, and indeed, Mr. Speaker, most importantly, I think the increased risk to one's health and safety. Mr. Speaker, we've been quite fortunate in my family. Just on a personal note, I had a niece that was, ironically, when she was a small child, she was playing with matches and she was burnt. And if it wasn't for the quick action of some of the paramedics and those that were quick to respond, and I think that's when the new air ambulance system came in, Mr. Speaker, I fear for whether that young lady would be here today, but she is. I can only comment about another situation in our family when another family member, received the effects of fire. So I'm sure everyone in this chamber, Mr. Speaker, can relate in one way or the other to the seriousness and the endangerments of what fires can do. And without volunteer firefighters, Mr. Speaker, I'm afraid that it's going to continue. Another aspect, Mr. Speaker, is the fact that insurance industry, depending upon the level of service. Earlier this year, there was a constituent of mine and his family. They lost their home in the upscale Sydney River area. And part of the problem was because of the heavy snow and the fire hydrants were covered. The other facet, Mr. Speaker, is because they were fighting the effects of the cold weather. And if it wasn't for the fast action of the adjoining volunteer fire departments, who were able to come to the rescue of the Sydney River Volunteer Fire Department.
Order, please. There's too much noise in the chamber to ask all members to take their conversations outside, please. All member Cape Breton West has the floor.
Well, Mr. Speaker, if it wasn't for the quick action of the adjoining volunteer fire departments, there could have been many other homes in Sydney River that would have been lost, and dear knows, could have been some lives lost as well. Perhaps this family was lucky because the fire was in the middle of the afternoon, and the two young occupants that were home were able to escape that fire. And it only takes minutes at most to engulf, some of these homes. Mr. Speaker, many volunteer fire departments are dealing with a lot of situations that require the services of the Fire Marshal's Office, particularly in industrial Cape Breton. I believe the highest percentage of fire inspections by the Fire Marshal's Office of any jurisdiction in the province of Nova Scotia is in industrial Cape Breton. That's right, Mr. Penny and Mr. McCormick. Mr. Speaker, I believe the figures will bear out on that. And that's not because there are more violations. It's because of a combination of a number of factors, one of which has been because of the excellent working relationship that the Fire Marshal's Office officials in the Sydney office has with these volunteer fire departments. Every year, almost without exception, Mr. Speaker, there will be a representative from the Fire Marshal's Office come and participate in the annual training and annual celebrations and deliberations and the swearing in of officers and so on of all these volunteer fire departments in my riding. And it's that type of collaborative approach which really is a plus for these communities. And it's that type of benefit, Mr. Speaker. I fear that the government will miss an opportunity here. And it could be quite some time before we come back to an issue like this, because it's like everything else. The government has the majority, and no matter what we say on this side of the House, at the end of the day, whatever the government decides is what they're going to do, and that will become law. So, Mr. Speaker, we can, we can lay out point after point on what we feel are ways to go and how to achieve them. But if the government doesn't want to do it, well, so be it. But I do believe, Mr. Speaker, I think the minister would be well advised to make a formal request, as I've said before, of Mr. Stewie and Mr. Comeau, and indeed the fire marshal, to appear before law amendments and give us some substantive detail on this particular piece of legislation. But, Mr. Speaker, it's lacking in detail. It's lacking in detail. It is lacking in substance because it only addresses a selected number of volunteer firefighters in this province, and many of the paid ones are already covered under different plans. So, Mr. Speaker, with that, I thank you for the opportunity to raise these few remarks. Thank you.
Member Cole Harbour from Passage.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm glad to have an opportunity to speak on this bill. This is an important piece of legislation, and I think it's important that the members of the House understand a bit of background on the nature of the Workers' Compensation Act, which I'm sure we're all familiar with. You know, every day or on a regular basis as MLAs, I'm sure we have people come through our doors with a lot of problems that are related to workers' compensation. This bill doesn't address the vast majority of those. It addresses one specific issue, which is the issue of firefighters and whether or not they should have what is called automatic assumption, that if they contract certain diseases, occupational diseases, which are not listed as to what exactly those diseases are in this bill. But, Mr. Speaker, if they contract such diseases, then there will be an automatic assumption that they will receive workers' compensation. And it's a noble goal. I think all of us here are, by introducing this legislation, and I know that my colleague from Cape Breton Centre introduced similar legislation with a little more detail. But, Mr. Speaker, by introducing this legislation, I think the government is recognizing that in Nova Scotia, as they've done in other provinces, we recognize that there is an occupational hazard in firefighting that does create certain occupational diseases, and because of that, we are going to assume that people have that disease and our firefighters will be compensated unless the opposite is proven. Mr. Speaker, we already do that here with coal miners, with many diseases that coal miners have faced over the years. But, Mr. Speaker, I think what is just as important is a bit of background to the system that has been created in workers' compensation. And why we need this background is to understand why it's like putting a fresh coat of paint over rotten wood, Mr. Speaker.
Oh, yeah, what happens?
It's not very long before the rot seeps through that fresh coat of paint and we end up seeing that, and the paint peels off, Mr. Speaker, and we end up seeing that it's still rotten to the core. And to some extent, that is what we have in a workers' compensation system. Again, good legislation, Mr. Speaker, but based on a system that has a lot of problems. Mr. Speaker, first, to make it clear, my background, so everyone understands, originally related to this area, a prosecutor in Ontario doing occupational health and safety prosecutions. Subsequently returning to Nova Scotia, I worked on Occupational Health and Safety Act after Westray.
So you know what you're talking about.
And then after that, Mr. Speaker, I represented injured workers through the Workers' Compensation, the Workers' Advisors Program. That being said, Mr. Speaker, I think it is important to reflect on some of the background. First of all, Mr. Speaker, occupational diseases can be a very difficult thing for people to have to prove, a Workers' Compensation Board. The fact that this legislation has been introduced is a good thing because firefighters will not have to fight that uphill battle of proving that if they get brain cancer, well, again, I shouldn't even specify any type because there are no specific illnesses identified in this legislation. But the one that has been specifically talked about in the media and other places is brain cancer. That the preponderance of brain cancer in firefighters is much higher than the normal rate for the average Nova Scotian or average Canadian, Mr. Speaker. Therefore, I am presuming that in the regulations, this government will at least identify brain cancer as one in which firefighters will be automatically assumed to be compensated unless the contrary is proven. But, Mr. Speaker, very difficult to prove. Medical records are difficult to compile to prove that there was no pre-existing conditions. In many cases, the workers have to show to medical officers with the Workers' Compensation Board and to caseworkers when it comes to occupational disease, Mr. Speaker, that their disease, that they worked in certain jobs, that there are records proving how long they've worked in those jobs, that those correlate to effects of exposure to certain chemicals or certain biological hazards, and as a result of that combination and having to compile all those records, then you have to make that still leap that is a cause and effect. And Mr. Speaker, that's compounded in this province, I may note, and the Minister of Labour can correct me if I'm wrong on this, but it's my understanding that still in this province, we use as threshold limit values, or TLVs, for chemical exposures, rates that go back to 1975. Those have been updated on an annual basis by industrial hygienists of North America, Mr. Speaker. Those TLVs are updated annually. They have changed dramatically in the last 28 years, yet we still use rates going back to 1975. That's a major problem in itself, Mr. Speaker. How can we confirm whether or not someone is exposed to a hazardous chemical when we're using rates? There's been scientific proof in the last 28 years that it can turn on its ear those rates that were identified in 1975, let alone the fact, Mr. Speaker, that those rates used in 1975 rates are based mainly on chronic exposure. Sorry, not chronic, acute exposure in many cases, where it's a one-time only exposure. That means the level is much higher than if you're exposed over a week or a year or, let's say, 20 years. And because of that, Mr. Speaker, we have as a basis of proof the legal standard in this province, antiquated rates of exposure, in many cases based on acute exposure, not chronic exposure. That in itself produces a massive burden on the part of workers to have to prove whether or not their exposure was work-related. And therefore, that resulted in a disease. Many times in the past, I've observed, and others have observed, Mr. Speaker, workers who clearly were exposed to chemical or biological hazards that by standards that would be by today's standards or standards that were identified based on clear and consistent scientific research would show that those workers were exposed at a level that could cause the illness they have. Yet in this province, because we use standards that are 28 years old, and in scientific terms, that is a massive change since then, Mr. Speaker. We are in a position where many of those workers are not getting the rights that they deserve. I think what's also important to reflect on within the workers' compensation system, Mr. Speaker, is the role of medical officers. And I know that there are people in the Workers' Compensation Board who will read these remarks, and maybe they've done it in the past, maybe they'll do it in the future. They feel offended by these comments. But let me be clear. The medical officers are a problem. They're a problem in our system because in many cases they never see these workers. And in the case of firefighters, they'll probably never meet them. They will look at a medical file and they have an institutional bias against those workers, period. Their position usually is, how do we try and stop these people from getting compensated? And time after time after time, workers tell stories of these medical officers that do this, Mr. Speaker. And what we're going to get with this legislation is potentially medical officers, even with automatic assumption, and I think the member from Cape Breton West noted this, we're going to have medical officers that will be looking through files with fine-tooth combs trying to identify how they may be able to reverse this. That may happen, it may not happen. I hope that with automatic assumption that they don't, but there's nothing in this legislation, Mr. Speaker, that would stop them from taking on that role. You know, in some cases you could use terms like it's rebuttable. That forces a legal burden on the worker or on the Workers' Compensation Board to have legal proof. But in the case, and I'm not so sure the language in this, and not to get too much into the language, Mr. Speaker, I'm not sure the language in this is strong enough that would avoid those medical officers from turning around and trying to prove contrary, whatever that might be, prove contrary that the worker did not get exposed at work. Mr. Speaker, that's a problem. That's a problem with this legislation. It is a problem with the workers' compensation system. Again, putting a fresh coat of paint on this before an election to say that volunteer firefighters and firefighters in this province will be protected, noble goal, one we all agree with. But the rot that's underneath that fresh coat of paint that is the workers' compensation system will only create problems. The paint will begin to crack, it will begin to peel, the rot will be exposed again, And the people who will suffer will be those volunteer firefighters and paid firefighters who think they're getting protection with this legislation. Until we address the system, until we address the workers' compensation system in this province, Mr. Speaker, we will continue to have ongoing problems. I want to talk about a couple of other problems. We have a system, Mr. Speaker, it's like a quilt, or it's like, a patch job. We have, Mr. Speaker, legislation that in workers' comp, I'll give credit, in the early 90s, it was an attempt to write a whole new Workers' Compensation Act. But again, we've gotten back to patchwork amendments. Bill 90, which was introduced by the member from Cape Breton West when he was the Minister of Labour, a bill that we opposed in the minority government, a bill that was supported by the Tories and Liberals. Mr. Speaker, that was a bill that tried to quietly end a court ruling that specifically addressed issues of chronic pain and how workers are going to be paid through chronic pain. Bill 90 was a compromise that the other two parties believed was the right thing to do. Yet again, it's now before the Supreme Court of Canada as to whether or not that legislation, Bill 90, and the resolution that was, the compromise that was passed in that legislation is constitutional. We may find out in the matter of months, maybe longer, Mr. Speaker, as to whether or not that whole Bill 90 and the whole workers' compensation system is going to be thrown for a loop. And we're going to have, if it is recognized as unconstitutional, what they've done in the chronic pain regulations and with how chronic pain is dealt with, Mr. Speaker, we are going to be back at trying to deal with a workers' compensation system that is in serious trouble. And that will be supported by decisions of the Supreme Court of Canada, potentially, if they decide that the chronic pain regulations are unconstitutional. And again, what we hoped was patchwork that would resolve the issue in 1999. Well, again, the cracks will expose itself, and we could potentially be back at trying to address a system that clearly the rot is showing through. We've buried the rot for 4 years. We tried to put another patch on it with this legislation, Mr. Speaker, but in the long run, the rot will continue to be exposed because the workers' compensation system needs an overhaul that reflects the rights of the workers, reflects the rights of injured workers, reflects the rights of people in this province who think when they go to work, and because they get injured or obtain a disease because of work, are going to be compensated, Mr. Speaker. Many are, but many are not. And the ones who specifically suffer are the ones with disease, the most difficult ones to prove. If you break your leg at work, Workers' Compensation Board will probably treat you pretty fairly. But back injuries and diseases are almost impossible for workers to be able to get a fair shake. I can remember many workers who had carpal tunnel or who had epicondylitis or other forms of injury because of repetitive strain. And this province could easily pass legislation or regulations to help ensure how we define it and how workers who maybe are working in factories or are postal workers who are getting these injuries could be protected. But instead, no, we have a workers' comp system, Mr. Speaker, that has continually ignored the possibility of some form of assistance through regulation or recognition, at least defining the rules. And instead, Mr. Speaker, has gone on to try on a regular basis to shut down these claims, instead of actually recognizing that these workers did have an injury caused by work. And in return, those workers have to get lawyers, those lawyers end up arguing, and most of the cases that I remember, they were winning. Yet instead of the system trying to address it, we try and patch it over, we try and put the coat of paint on it in hopes that the rot will go away for a while, Mr. Speaker. It hasn't worked in the past. And though this legislation is good legislation for firefighters, Mr. Speaker, it's just another fresh coat of paint on a system that isn't working. I want to talk specifically, though, about volunteer firefighters. It's very important. Mr. Speaker, these, as the member from Cape Breton West noted, are the backbone of our communities. They're there to volunteer, not only as firefighters, but almost as a service club. They provide services well beyond just the firefighting that they're required in emergency situations, whether it is supplying water or whether it is services, fundraising that they might do as an organization in order to help those in the community, emergency services, ambulance services, traffic control. There's so many things that they do, Mr. Speaker. They are the backbone of our communities in rural Nova Scotia, and they are important. Mr. Speaker, I know from my own community, a community that had a vibrant volunteer fire department for years in Eastern Passage. Another one in Cole Harbour. These are still there, but with amalgamation and with HRM being created, it's more difficult to sort of build that bond. You can see that probably in other communities. If member from Sackville Beaverbank or the member from Bedford Fall River who have volunteer fire departments in their area, Sackville Cobequid. And ones who have them, you begin to see those volunteer firefighting services begin to decay and fall apart slowly but surely. As a result, we lose something in our community. We lose the soul of our community because of it. Now, this legislation is meant to provide something for those workers, Mr. Speaker. Those volunteer firefighters could potentially, if they obtain a disease, a cancer presumably, they could receive compensation. Well, here's the problem. The government doesn't define how a volunteer firefighter will be compensated. At what rate? How long does someone have to be a volunteer firefighter? 1 day? 1 week? 1 year? 10 years? 40 years? We don't know. I do know in Manitoba, where they have the legislation, it's between 12 and 20 years of permanent full-time service as a firefighter, paid firefighter, that if you contract a disease, you'll be recognized. Well, how many equivalent hours of service as a volunteer firefighter have to have before they're considered equivalent to someone with 12 years experience, 15 years, 20 years of full-time experience? I don't know the answer to that. And I don't think the government does either. And isn't it interesting that they haven't specifically spelled that out in this legislation, Mr. Speaker? There's an election coming. The last thing they want is legislation that says you have to be a volunteer firefighter for 40 years before you will see any benefit from this legislation. But let's be clear. That is potentially what this legislation is saying, Mr. Speaker. Potentially, if we assume that someone has to be a paid full-time firefighter for 12, 15, 20 years before this legislation will kick in, that for a volunteer firefighter, presumably, who isn't working as many hours, it could be more. But the government hasn't said that. That'll be buried in regulations sometime after the next election so that the people of Nova Scotia won't notice it until they show up at their workers' comp hearing. When some widow or some widower shows up because their husband or wife was a volunteer firefighter, wanted to particularly get automatic assumption, but somewhere's buried in the regulation, this government has identified how much service had to be provided by a volunteer firefighter before automatic assumption would kick in. And Mr. Speaker, the problem is...
Order, please, Honourable Deputy Premier.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I was wondering if the member opposite, I believe, is referring to the fact that there will be a length of time, a gestation period for the various cancers. Is he arguing against that? Because if I remember correctly, in their bill, they came out with a gestation period.
Yeah, Member Cole Harbour, Eastern Passage, there's a question for you.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. What I am saying, Mr. Speaker, is that wouldn't it have been nice if all this was clarified in the bill to spell out exactly how long these workers would have to be exposed, whether they be paid full-time firefighters, whether they be paid part-time firefighters, whether they be volunteer firefighters. My specific point, Mr. Speaker, is that no matter what, there are going to be people who assume by reading the press release or looking at the shiny pictures of the Minister of Environment and Labour at a press conference a few weeks ago, are going to assume that if they contract a cancer, again, I don't know what this bill is going to cover. It doesn't actually say what illnesses are covered in it. But, Mr. Speaker, they're going to assume that they themselves, if they get sick and happen to, God forbid, pass away because of an illness, they're going to assume their family is going to be taken care of because there's automatic assumption in here. Some were buried in regulations after the fact. Long after the next election, I presume, this government is going to spell out that. What does it mean? I don't know. You know, there are many people out there who are epidemiologists, who are occupational industrial hygienists, who probably do lots of years of studying before they can ever determine exactly how long. But this government has not spelled that out. And without that legislation, without that in the legislation, Mr. Speaker, I think there's clearly an opportunity for many Nova Scotians when they go to workers' comp looking for that automatic assumption for their widow, for their loved one who's passed away, who are volunteer firefighters, to not get the compensation they think that they're going to be entitled to. And we here in the Assembly will be again probably asking questions, raising resolutions, maybe even debating laws, putting that fresh coat of paint over to make sure that that crack that rot doesn't expose itself and that we move on. These are the problems we have with the system, Mr. Speaker. Again, good legislation, but I would hope that this government would have tried to spell out in some detail. This is the point of democracy, is that in legislation, people are openly told what to expect in legislation. There are a lot of questions in this law that need to be answered, ones that our caucus will be asking at law amendments. We will be expecting many others to come forward to ask these same questions as to exactly who's covered, how long they have to work or volunteer in order to be covered, Mr. Speaker. We don't know these answers. I want to talk a bit as well. This is, some would say, bitterly ironic that this government is bringing forward legislation to protect the loved ones of workers who died because of occupational disease. And it's bitterly ironic that this Minister of Environment and Labour, I think this is his second term in this government as the Minister of Labour, because I believe he was the Minister of Labour when they first became government back in 1999, Mr. Speaker. And you know why I know that? Because within literally days of this government being sworn in, this Minister of Labour came forward and announced that all those regulations that were being developed under the Occupational Health and Safety Act were going to be shelved. Shelved. And isn't it ironic that this government, just before an election, comes forward to help the loved ones of people who have died because of exposure in the workplace to an occupational disease, because of chemicals, yet at the same time does not have the fortitude to go out and the courage to go out and pass regulations that actually prevent these people from dying? Occupational health regulations, industrial health regulations, Mr. Speaker, that would spell out exposure levels that aren't antiquated, that aren't 28 years old, that spell out proper equipment, respiratory equipment, technical means, administrative means of ensuring that these workers are not overly exposed to what is causing the diseases that eventually they might be compensated for if they pass away. Mr. Speaker, these regulations are doable. They're done in most provinces in Canada, and this government has failed to act, has failed to ensure that those regulations are in place. So instead of putting in place what's necessary to ensure that workers are protected in the first place so that they don't get sick and don't die from an occupational disease, and indeed this government has specifically gone out and stopped regulations from being passed that would deal with that, in turn they wait 4 more years and bring forward legislation that will compensate workers and their family after they die. Something really ironic in that, Mr. Speaker. This government could be doing, and why not at the same time? Why not, when we're announcing what we're doing for firefighters who pass away because of occupational disease, why aren't we also talking about what we're going to do to ensure they don't get those diseases? It's not a fait accompli. We can't assume, Mr. Speaker, that these workers are all going to get cancer or whatever disease will be identified in the regulations, Mr. Speaker. There are means of stopping it. There are means of protecting those workers, and that should be our first priority. Protecting those that are entering firefighting services now or entered a few years ago so that they don't have to face the same problem as so many of their colleagues have had to face, and their families having to go to funerals of workers who have died because they were firefighters, because they were protecting us. It can be stopped. Yet this government refuses to pass regulations and legislation that would help protect those firefighters in the first place, and so many other workers who are being exposed on a daily basis to chemicals and biological hazards that are going to cause occupational disease and may eventually, in many cases, take their lives. But this government has refused to do that. They talk about red tape. They talk about the fact that we need to get off the backs of business.
Order, please. No member call Harbour Eastern Patches has the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. These are the problems that I have with this government's agenda. It's not about this legislation specifically. It's about the principle of this legislation and the principle of protecting firefighters who have occupational disease. We can protect them after the fact, after they die of those diseases, or we could do something beforehand so that they do live a long and full life with their families. It isn't that complicated. Yet this government has ignored those opportunities in order, I would argue, for some political expediency. Our party has introduced similar legislation, while at the same time has consistently said we need new regulations under the Occupational Health and Safety Act to ensure that industrial hazards, exposure to industrial levels of chemical and biological hazards people are protected from, that we have new levels of threshold limit values, TLVs, that reflect today's scientific evidence, not the evidence of 1975. It's not that hard. A lot of the work has already been done. It wouldn't be that hard to do more work, yet this government, on almost the first act it did, the government of Westray, I may note, this is the party of Westray, Mr. Speaker, one of the first things they did when they came into power, one of the first things this minister did when he came into power, was shelve regulations under the new Occupational Health and Safety Act that would have provided more protection for firefighters, police officers, and so many other workers, all the workers in this province that come under provincial jurisdiction. And yet this government has failed to do that as a minimum. And even when they try and do something for firefighters, Mr. Speaker, they do half a job. We don't know how long a worker, either volunteer or paid, has to work in order to get compensation. We don't know what diseases they will be compensated for automatically. We don't know these things. This government has passed a legislation that literally is 1 1/4 pages long. 3 clauses, Mr. Speaker. That's it. And Mr. Speaker, the real problem is there are so many details that need to be put into this legislation, and yet they're not in here. There's so many other things this government has to do if they have a legitimate and serious concern for the health and safety of firefighters, both volunteer and paid. Yet they don't do that either. And what we get, again, with regard to the protection of workers and the compensation of workers, is a fresh coat of paint to try and cover up the rot in the system, instead of actually trying to build a system that helps protect the workers, protect their loved ones, so that they are able not to go to work and be exposed to chemicals. I mean, I can't imagine being a firefighter right now, Mr. Speaker, and thinking this government recognizes that we are dying from diseases, yet they are doing nothing to allow me, when I go to work, to feel comfortable in the knowledge that I'm being protected from those diseases. They'll compensate me if I die from one. They'll compensate my family. But what are they doing to make sure that I don't get sick in the first place? What are they doing to ensure I live a full life? I can enjoy my retirement with my grandchildren, maybe even my great-grandchildren if I'm lucky enough, because I'm not going to be exposed to those chemicals in the first place. They don't have that comfort. What they know is they're going to work with the full knowledge that this government recognizes that they're being exposed on a daily basis to chemicals, to the point in which they're going to assume that the diseases, whichever ones they identify, are ones that they should be compensated for automatically. That's a big political step. That's a big legal step in making that recognition. Yet they will not go the extra step, or I would say the first steps, of trying to protect those people from it in the first place, Mr. Speaker. That's a real shame, and something I think this government is going to hold its head down for in the long term. Because again, the rot will seep through the fresh coat of paint, and we'll be back here again debating these issues, Mr. Speaker. This is the way we've dealt with workers' compensation for too long. And I would hope that this government would have learned its lessons and tried to do things differently. Mr. Speaker, it's not just about regulating occupational health and safety, there's also education. We could be doing a lot to try and educate workers, educate, in many cases, firefighters are going into homes and businesses, and maybe that's where they're being exposed to these chemicals because of the fire. We don't know. It may not just be straight fire. It could be a fire that's mixed with certain chemicals that are burning or what have you. We don't know the specific reason, but there is studies out there that probably can tell us. If we're making these assumptions, then there must be studies telling us what they're being exposed to. And if we know what they're being exposed to, Mr. Speaker, then we should be able to prevent them from getting exposed. And that's not only regulation, it's also education. It's educating those firefighters. It's educating homeowners and business owners as to what they have in their places for fire safety. It's about preventing fires so workers aren't exposed. All these things can be done, yet this government refuses to do many of them, Mr. Speaker. This legislation takes baby steps towards protecting firefighters in this province. It goes a long way to recognizing, takes major steps, Mr. Speaker, towards recognizing that firefighters, whether volunteer or paid, part-time or full-time firefighters, Mr. Speaker, are exposed to chemical and biological hazards that kill them, period. Their work kills them. That's what this legislation says. Yet this legislation only takes tiny steps, in fact, I would argue probably none, towards preventing those illnesses. And in many cases, with regard to how they're compensated, when they're compensated, and for how long they have to work before they're compensated, Mr. Speaker, this legislation is silent. We didn't need another coat of paint in the workers' compensation system, Speaker. We need something more substantive that's addressing the problems in the system. And this legislation, though it's only a tiny piece of that puzzle, could at least show the government's commitment towards that. We don't see it here, Mr. Speaker. And we look forward to law amendments to be able to talk to the people of this province and to the firefighters of this province as to what they have to say on this legislation and what they have to say with regard to how they're protected in the workplace. And I look forward to further debate. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable member for Cape Breton Nova.
Mr. Speaker, I'm glad to be here tonight to speak on this bill. Now, I notice that this bill is this government's amendment to the Workers' Compensation Act for this session. That's what it is. And I have here on my desk a document that has already been tabled in the House, and unless I read from it, I don't need to table it again. That's the library's copy, by the way.
Margaret wants it back.
Margaret wants it back, exactly, and 2 cents a day fine if it's kept out more than 2 weeks. Anyway, this document over here recommends to this government steps to take on workers' compensation. It was made 13 months ago by a committee of 8 headed by a Mr. Dorsey, not the fellow who blew the trumpet. Although you could say that this fellow did blow his trumpet when it came to workers' compensation. Blew it quite well. Now, was this particular amendment at the head of their list of recommendations? No, it wasn't. Was it anywhere in their list of recommendations? Well, it's a big book, Mr. Speaker, as you know, and I can't go through all those pages just like that. But I'm sure the Minister of Labour has. He's had time to anyway. You know, and there are so many recommendations in that report that could have been acted on that one wonders, you know, is this all? Is this all that there is? That was one of Peggy Lee's songs. Hit in 1971, I believe. Is that all there is? This bill, when you have this much raw material to work from? Well, apparently it is. That's all there is. I noticed we had another bill in here, Bill number 2, that seemed to say about the same thing, but seemed to say it in a more readable form. It seemed to have some substance to it, some meat. But this bill, Bill 1, is an enabling bill, empowering the Governor and Council to do things that I think the Governor and Council already has the legal power to do. Exactly. In other words, the bill is not really necessary if the government wanted to act to help the firefighters. It would simply go down to the cabinet room, wherever they meet now. They used to meet in the bunker, but now I hear they've moved upstairs somewhere. But they could go there, wherever it is, and they could pass regulations, and they could have it all done by Thursday, by Holy Thursday. Have the job all done, instead of tying us up here in the House for this piece of legislation that really doesn't amount to a hill of beans, because it says that they can do things that they already have the power to do. And so it's just simply repetition. And I thought we had a rule in this House against repetition. I thought that was in the rules. But repetition, unduly vexatious and trivial in nature, was considered to be out of order. Is the bill out of order? I do not know. I don't know. But I do know that the bill is very, very close to the border. I think I can say that in my humble opinion, Mr. Speaker. The bill, first of all, attempts to define what a firefighter is. And that's kind of a hard definition, because we have a variety of municipalities in the province, and they have different ways of doing things. Now, if the Halifax Regional Municipal Unit was to employ the honourable member for Halifax Chebucto, as a legal advisor, but on a part-time basis, also assign him to firefighting duties as needed, would this bill cover him? I suggest if you read it carefully, you would see it probably doesn't. It would probably have to go all the way to the Supreme Court of Canada to get a legal interpretation to say that, well, perhaps maybe it does, but we're not sure. You know? Because it requires that all firefighting employees be full-time firefighting employees. You can't have a mechanic who can also drive the fire truck when the fire whistle sounds. That's not allowed. He has to spend his day polishing the fire truck when there's no fire, or oiling it, or changing the tires, but he's not permitted to do anything else. Is that good? Is that sound municipal administration? I don't think that's the kind of municipal administration the honourable member for Cape Breton West would propose. I have my doubts about many other members of the House, just looking around the room here. Why? Why does this government determine in its wisdom that if you're employed as a firefighter, you can't do anything else? What about the firefighter who sweeps the firehouse? Is by sweeping he taking himself out of the provisions of this bill? I would suggest that a very strong case could be made to argue, yes, it would, because he's not a firefighter full-time, he's also a 10% of the time sweeper. That's what the bill says. If you look at its reading, if you read it carefully. Now that's the first thing this bill attempts to do, is to define what a firefighter is and to make a ruling, which I don't think we've ever had in this province before, that if you were a firefighter, you could not do anything else. You couldn't collect taxes. You couldn't paint. You'd have to get the painter to do the painting. With a nice ladder, he could paint the fire hall, but he's not allowed to have the paintbrush in his hand under this bill. Use the ladder, yes. Use the ladder, climb to the top, but then you can only climb down again. It reminds me of the story of prisoners who were put to work digging holes so they could fill them up again. That kind of work. That's in clause 2, 35A, sub 1. That's what that section means, in my view. And I trust my interpretation is just as good as anybody else's. Now, let's not deal with that particular clause at length. Let's go on to clause 2, 2 subsection 2. I'm not reading the NDP bill, I'm reading the government's bill. If you want me to go on to the NDP bill, that could be clause 2 of my speech. Now, this says when a worker has been a firefighter and suffers from cancer or other disease that is prescribed by the governor and council. That could be the measles. My. Imagine with an election coming, how they could make mischief with that particular clause. On Tuesday, they could put measles into the list. And on Wednesday, they could put mumps. And on Thursday, they could put in chicken pox. And German measles on Friday. Exactly. And on the list could go. I mean, that is what the government can do if we pass this bill unamended. They can go through a medical dictionary, and they can find 365 diseases, and pass one a day for 365 days to say, and cancer, and these other 365 diseases. That's what they have the legal power to do under Section 2, subsection 2 of this bill. Read it. See. Now, armed with that, the government propaganda says they are in touch. This is a schedule of PC nominating conventions across Nova Scotia. I think I might as well table that one so honourable members can read and see that they are in touch. This bill is no doubt evidence of how they are in touch. Because someone says they're touched. Well, I won't comment on that, Mr. Speaker. It's an interesting thought, because if they are touched, they can make much more mischief with Clause 2, subsection 2, than if they aren't. I think that's a fair observation. Oh, my. You know, what a way to address serious problems. Now, I was told not to speak about Bill 2 because it was NDP. But I'll say this, that the NDP had a method. They named specific diseases. they said a primary site brain cancer, primary site bladder cancer. They named various forms of lymphoma and leukemia. And that was what their bill dealt with. It didn't have this sort of name anything you want and stick it in the blank type clause. It didn't. Malaria. There's another one they can add onto their list. You know? I mean, if you pass a bill saying cancer and any other disease that the governor and council prescribes by way of regulation, you can put in anything that is recognized as a disease. You can. Now, I'm not going to name various diseases to try to get the members of the House laughing. I mean, we just need to think about all the serious health concerns there are out there. We're debating the estimates of the Department of Health and the Committee on Supply. And in that committee, we can examine all the diseases there are, and all the hospitals there are, and all the doctors and medicines there are to try to fight the different diseases that exist. Name them all, put them into this bill in Clause 2, subsection 2, because by passing regulations of sufficient volume, they can name every disease on the block and then some, and put them into this bill. And yet, purportedly, the purpose of the bill is to deal with the problem of occupational cancer. Now, I rest my case on 2.2. Let's move on to 2.3. I know we're not supposed to debate this stuff line by line or clause by clause. We're debating the principle of the bill, but the principle is enumerated in the clauses, I submit. Yes. Now, we're looking at the general provisions of the bill. The governor and council, this is 2.4. The governor and council may make regulations prescribing diseases for the purposes of subsection 2. Well, that's what I've just been talking about. Again, it's repetitious because it repeats clause 2.2 as clause 2.4 and says the same thing again. They used to say, etc., etc. I don't know about adding ad nauseum, but some speakers have used that as a conclusion for a series of et ceteras. Now, that's what this bill does. And they have other clauses in here, prescribing periods of employment or volunteer work for the purposes of subsection 3. Now, that gives the governor and council the power to make regulations laying out anything they want. Anything they want. You know, Mr. Speaker, you could put down that only firefighters earning less than $3,000 a year shall be eligible. Or you could pass a regulation saying only firefighters earning more than $100,000 per year shall be eligible. Yes. You guys would do worse. You probably pass a... Oh, here we have a question, Mr. Speaker. I can't give up the opportunity.
Colchester Muscataba Valley on a question.
Speaker, having only been around this chamber for nearly 10 years now, I want to say that this government, in its short mandate, has done more for the volunteer firefighter than any government within the last decade. Free license plates for firefighters, Volunteer Firefighters Day, protection for firefighters against court actions, $100,000 to the family of firefighters if, God forbid, they lose their life in the line of duty, and a Firefighters Compensation Act. How dare that member for Cape Breton Nova stand and accuse this government and cast aspersions that we might make this available to only firefighters that earn over $100,000, when in fact it was us that brought in the volunteer fire department and 131 volunteer fire departments across Nova Scotia, 131 volunteer firefighter stations across Nova Scotia will benefit. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Order, please. The honourable member for Colchester Muscataba Valley is not a point of order, but he certainly clarified the facts for the House. The honourable member for Cape Breton Nova has the floor.
I thoroughly enjoyed his speech, Mr. Speaker. While he was speaking, I was reading this list of progressive conservative nominating conventions, and I noticed that Colchester Muscataba Valley is not on the list. But I leave that for him to straighten out with his own party. Now, as far as what the government did for the firefighters, I recall that when our party was in power, Mr. Speaker, we brought in a budget by the Honourable Don Down. A budget that before it had ever been printed, the Honourable member opposite in that direction had said must be rejected, even although they had never read it. But when they found out what was in it, I'm talking about them and them, those two together, the PC-NDP axis. Well, I shouldn't call it that, but the PC-NDP alliance, that group. They found within it provision for free license plates for volunteer firefighters. And the hair of the NDP stood up on end like that, and the hair of the PC stood up like that. And the two of them got together and said, we've got to defeat this budget because it contains that provision. And they did. And that's how they got into power. That's how they got from 19 members down to 11 or 10, whatever. And that's how we got over here, because of that act of treachery against the volunteer firemen of Nova Scotia. So, I rest my case. I can say no more. But I thank the honourable member opposite for his most entertaining and illuminating speech. Now, where were we? The Governor and Council may make regulations prescribing periods of employment or volunteer work for the purposes of being considered a firefighter. Well, that means what it says, Mr. Speaker. It gives them absolute and unfettered power to make the most ridiculous and nonsensical regulations that they want. You know, if they think, well, if we say that all people earning any money at all as a volunteer fireman, even $1 a year, just like when you buy a piece of property, it says, whereas in consideration for the payment of $1, the parties agree here too, the transaction of title. All right, well, they can put in a clause saying if you earn $1 a year as a firefighter, you're entitled. Or conversely, they could put in, if you earn even $1 a year, you're not entitled. Only those that get absolutely nothing shall be entitled. And so on and so forth. Why do we need to have these things in law? What is the need of this legislature sitting at 9:30 in the evening to debate such a proposed law? It doesn't make sense, in my view. Prescribing the earliest effective date for the payment of benefits with respect to the diseases prescribed for the purpose of subsection 2. And that's a very important section there, because it gives the Cabinet the unfettered power to set dates of onset. Dates of onset. In disability cases, a date of onset is of paramount importance. If you sign up for an insurance policy that has a clause in it that states, notwithstanding when the disease actually began, this company shall consider your disability to be effective as of the 5th day of April 2010. Well, that's what the insurance says. And you pay for it. You get nothing if you become disabled before that date because the policy says there's no payment required. None will be paid. Now, this gives the government the power to do the same thing. There are no grounds stated. There are no qualifications stated. It gives them the power to set whatever they want. They could set a date in the next century. They could set a date not later than 2 years before or after this bill is passed, or whatever turns them on. You know, you're voting for, shall we say, free enterprise when you vote for this bill, because you're giving the government the freedom, the enterprising power to put whatever they want in there, and so you can leave here thinking, oh boy, we passed a nice bill to help the firemen. We've actually passed a bill that contains the powers to destroy any benefits that the bill might convey if the Governor and Council gets out of control when the moon is full or whatever it is that makes them go the wrong way. Now that's that one. They're howling already, Mr. Speaker, and it's only 9:30. Now, what else does the bill prescribe? The exercise by the Governor and Council of the authority contained in subsection 4 in regulations within the meaning of the Regulations Act. Well, that's like maybe putting in another clause saying, and all definitions not covered by this bill shall be governed by the Definitions Act, the Evidence Act, and such other statutes as might apply. It's what they call padding. I used to be a school teacher, and I'm familiar with padding. And it means that you write the longest answer you can, putting 3 words to a line, so that with a yardstick, it looks like a long answer. The answer may contain nothing in terms of substance, but it looks impressive. And it's a quality that politicians frequently develop as they mature in office, the ability to say a great deal, but mean nothing. So a clause is put in here sort of saying that. to give extra additional space to the bill and make it go over to page 2. Now let's get to page 2. Subsection 83, subsection 2 does not apply with respect to a firefighter who learned before this section came into force that the firefighter suffered from a disease prescribed pursuant to this section. Now that's a very serious clause to put into a bill, because it means that the bill will only apply to those that in the future develop cancer or other diseases who don't know now at the time that we pass it that they have such a condition. In other words, it's a retroactive nullification within a bill, which is a very unusual step to put into this kind of program, because what you're trying to do generally in social legislation is to convey and grant benefits to people. It's not to take them away from them. Yet the clause that I just read has that very effect. It means that if right now I know that because I was a firefighter for 25 years and inhaled all kinds of poisonous gases while fighting fire, and I've now developed lung cancer, inoperable, I don't get anything out of this bill. I only get benefits if the bill is passed, proclaimed, and then the day after that, I get the diagnosis confirmed. That's what that clause I just read means. You know? Now, let me say this about all this. They have more members in the House than we do. We only have a handful of them here. There's 4 members right now present on the opposition side. I'm not talking about members that are absent. I'm talking about those that are present. We have 4. They have all those. Now, if they're concerned about the problems that I'm raising here and enunciating, why don't they get up and give us the answers? Because maybe I'm wrong. Maybe some of the things that I've said are perhaps incorrect. And if any of them over there that are wanting to get up and set me straight, like the honourable member for Colchester Musqueam did there a few moments ago,
Keep going fishing.
They can go at me. I'm here as a target. But we don't hear any response from them. They'll only just let the bill be debated to exhaustion, and then the Minister of Labour will get up and say, Mr. Speaker, I move second reading of the bill. And that will be the total examination that the bill will get here in the House. Is that a good way to legislate? I thought that bills proposed by any member of the House here would be subjected to all-party examination. You know? I won't get off into procedure in the British House, but I'll tell you, Mr. Speaker, that's not the way they do things in the British House at all. In fact, the government in power, when I was over there when John Major was Prime Minister, he had a terrible problem with rebellion in his back benches. He had a paper majority of 2, and he stayed in power by courting the rebellious members of the opposition and getting them to vote with the government so he could stay in office, and did that for a long time. You want me to get into Churchill? Not at the moment. For greater certainty, Mr. Member for Colchester Musqueam, for greater certainty, compensation payable for the period before this section came into force.
Order, please. Order, please. I think the extent of the honourable member quite latitude, and the honourable member of Cape Breton-Nova certainly has a lot more experience in this House than I do, and particularly as Speaker, and he'd know that we are in the second reading of this bill, the principle, which is not to be read sentence by sentence or clause by clause. So I'll ask the honourable member to get back to the principle of the bill, please. The honourable member of Cape Breton-Nova has the floor.
I agree with you, Mr. Speaker, and possibly to prevent a repetition of sin, I'll close the book. Now, the principle of the bill. What is the principle of the bill? I've already gone through the bill and tried to find principle, but it escaped me. It flew out of my butterfly net. And, you know, maybe the Minister of Labour could explain what the principle of the bill is so we could have something to focus our debate on. As I read it, it's a series of enabling provisions, enabling the government to provide compensation for cancer or any other disease, but you can't know that you have it at the time the bill was passed. You have to find out about that at least the day after. And it enables the Governor and Council to lay out how long you can be employed as a firefighter. I mean, it could be 2 years, 10 years, 20 years. How much money you make as a firefighter. It could be $10, $100, or $1,000 or whatever. They can determine all that in the cabinet room, and that, I suggest, is the principle of the bill. that would give the government those powers. Now, if I'm wrong, I'll stand corrected. I've invited them to get up and tell me where I'm wrong. But I hear nothing. Now, I have some firefighters in my constituency. I just did a little calculation with a member for Cape Breton West, and I found that I have 5 fire departments or stations in my riding. Grand Lake Road, South Bar, and New Victoria are all volunteer, completely. The 2 in Sydney, in Ashby and in Whitney Pier, are professional firefighting forces like you normally find in a city. Okay? But in all, that's 5 firefighting departments. So I have a stake in this, Mr. Speaker. Some of the people I'm up here represented are directly and personally involved in this bill. And for that reason, I want to see this bill done in the best way possible. Now, I know that on this level of debate, we're supposed to debate the principle of the bill of, are we in favor of the bill or are we not? Now, ostensibly, the purpose of the bill is to help the firefighter who has cancer. But if you look at the specific details of the bill, you find out that the power is there to take all that away. That's what I find, you know. And I think that that is the ultimate essence of the legislative process, to examine legislation, find if it's satisfactory or not, and if it's not satisfactory, to identify where and how. Now, there are all kinds of firefighters in Nova Scotia that have been injured, that do have these diseases that the bill is designed to address right now. Because this bill is advanced with a purpose. It's not advanced just simply to kill time. As I understand it, my friends across the way are very much on a schedule. And the countdown is now on. And the days are passing. And they want to be out of here, and they want to be out doing something else. You see? And they wouldn't pass any piece of legislation unless they felt it fit into their package of showing that they are in touch with the people. Are you a Hamite? Well, I had my name on the ballot 10 times, Brooke. I think that was enough. But anyway. Anyway, who knows? I might try it again. Now, we have all kinds of volunteer firefighters in Nova Scotia that undoubtedly have these diseases now. I don't know at what stage. I'm not a doctor. I can't say whether they're fatal or not, whether they're terminal or not. Let's just say that there are 3,000 firefighters in Nova Scotia that have either cancer or any other disease that you can think of that could be put into this bill. And none of them will get any benefits if the bill is passed, because it says so. They have to find out the day after the bill gets proclaimed. That's what the bill says. Huh? So I can't understand why anyone across the way would take pride in the passage of this piece of legislation. It doesn't produce the goods. It has no beef. It's a retrograde measure that will take away the very things that it promises. Have, but don't have, all at once. That's the Conservative Act. Well, we want to know what the opinion is of the Workers' Compensation Board on this legislation, Mr. Speaker. I believe in that. I believe in the principle contained in this report. And that principle was one of consultation with those who had studied the field in depth and made informed policy recommendations to government. You know, I've looked through this book from cover to cover, and I can't find anywhere in it a recommendation that we do what this bill is doing, to take benefits away because people know that they have a disease. That's not a principle of workers' compensation. Workers' compensation has been in this province for a long time. It has never been based on that principle at all. It's been based on the principle that if you have a demonstrable injury or industrial accident from your employment, you will then be compensated. That's why it's called the Workers' Compensation Board. It's not a discompensation board. It's a giving compensation board. This bill will not further the aims of that board. This bill will take away from the board powers that I think it has now. Because I know from experience with firefighters and with other workers that if they have inhaled smoke and fumes and flame and so forth, and there is a demonstrable after effect in the form of a burn or a toxic condition or a disease, emphysema, you name it, that they are compensated now. They are, under the terms of the Workers' Compensation Act. I know that, Mr. Speaker, because I've taken such cases on and I've won them. I've won them. Now, this bill, as I see it, would take that power away from the Workers' Compensation Board. It would say that because Joe knew yesterday that he had inhaled fumes from the burning chemical factory that he was putting the fire out at, and got the diagnosis from the doctor yesterday that you suffered a tremendous problem to your health, he wouldn't get anything because the bill said so. Now, I don't know how much I can rest my case on this. You know, I'd like to know what Louis Comeau and David Stewie have to say about this bill. I know that they can come in as witnesses before the Law Amendments Committee, but will they? Would the Minister of Labour make a commitment to that effect? If he could get them, Louis and Stewie, I'm told. Louis and Stewie, get them in before the Law Amendments Committee and let them tell the committee, you know, of what they think of this particular piece of legislation. Is Upper Stewiacke in your constituency? Yes. I thought so. Yes.
Why isn't he standing up for the volunteers?
I have here in my hand a summary of the Workers' Compensation Act. It's only 2 pages long, the same length as the bill, but it has one section that's circled, and that is presumption when 100% impairment. Now that refers to a clause, I should know it by number. My constituency system does, but I don't. But there is a section in the bill stating that when, not in this bill, but in the Act, stating that when disability is total, or 100%, that the benefit of the doubt has to be given to the worker. That's called benefit of the doubt. Benefit of the doubt. Now, at a later stage in the bill's debate, if they want to press this matter forward, I can get the Workers' Compensation Act and read that section out to the House, but it is in there. It is a section that is diametrically opposite to the bill now before the House. The benefit of the doubt states that the worker is to receive when the, now you'll have to help me on this one, somebody who's a lawyer, maybe my friend from Halifax, Shabakto, but when the preponderance of evidence is more or less in favor of the worker, the board is instructed by law to go all the way and give the worker the benefit of the doubt. Judge Judy, all right. I don't care. If Judge Judy makes those kinds of rulings, I support her. Yes. Now, you know, that's in the Act now. Does this bill take that out of the Act? The answer is it doesn't. And so you're going to amend the Workers' Compensation Act by putting a clause up here saying, you know, you don't get any compensation unless you find out that you are sick the day after the bill is passed. But down here in the same law, you've got another section saying, but you shall have the benefit of the doubt. You know? It's like you're innocent and you're guilty at the same time. Hard to figure out. Now, Mr. Speaker, I have all kinds of notes here, and I guess some want me to go through them line by line. Why are the Conservative backbenchers not standing up for their volunteer firefighters, reads one such note. Well, I can't do anything more than invite them to. We have regulations under the Workers' Compensation Act now in effect, and these provide for, among other things, that the following classes of workers are excluded from the Act. Wait a minute now. Persons employed by a city, town, or municipal corporation as members of a police force or the fire department. These are regulations under the Compensation Act that are in conflict with the Act. If the government wants to help the firefighters, it could just repeal that regulation, this one. That's all it needs. But instead of doing that, they want to do something that looks spectacular, so as to show that they are in touch, and therefore this bill. Well, I don't know what more I can say, Mr. Speaker. I seem to be making a case against this bill. I didn't start out with that intention. It just kind of developed as I went along because I took a look at the bill. See, that's what you have to do if you want to understand legislation. You have to read it, just like a book, you know, from cover to cover. Then you get the big picture. What's that? Nothing. Oh, my, I thought he was going to speak. I would have sat down if he had gotten up to speak, as I did for the member for Colchester, Musqueam Valley. I speak to my firefighters. All right. Will you speak?
Tell them why you're not giving them 100% coverage.
I will. Well, I give them their 100%.
Well, there are many, many ways in which these problems could be addressed. Mr. Speaker, in general terms, I think that the bill it's too vague. It's too vague. Let me tell you about this. I'm looking around this chamber and I'm seeing 4 paintings on the wall. And there's another one over there. 5 paintings. They're all well done paintings. They're paintings of Sir John Thompson, Sir Charles Tupper, Joseph Howe. I think that one is John Uniacke, and this one is Mr. Fielding. Now, they look like those men. Wayne Adams. Well, that's not a painting. That's a photograph. Difference. But don't let me get into that one. If someone had taken a tube of paint and given it to a baby to squeeze over a canvas like that, and then put it up for sale at $25,000 as a great piece of work, great piece of art, I don't think too many people will want to buy it because it wouldn't be a picture of anything. Now that's what this bill reminds me of. It's not a clear picture of anything. It's not like the picture over there of Sir John Thompson. You can see his nose and his lips and his ears and his hair. But in this bill, you can't see where it will lead us to. Might lead us right over the brink. So, you know, I kind of think that this bill doesn't really merit much support. I can't get enthusiastic over it. Maybe the Minister of Labour said something that I didn't hear. It lacks clarity. How's that? It lacks clarity. And I think it would be a fair proposition to make in taking my seat, Mr. Speaker. I'm not here to keep the House all night. Some want me to? No, I won't. I think the government should put clarity to this bill. I think they should amend it. Perhaps even we might be able to prepare an amendment overnight. Bring it in tomorrow. But we should be able to look at this bill so that we would have it. If they want to deal with cancer, let the bill deal with cancer. Take out that stuff about any other disease that you think of by Tuesday. Take that out. Take out this definition of a firefighter by which somebody who also swept the floor and swung a paintbrush would be excluded. Have it cover all firefighters. I would think that the proper definition to use for a firefighter would be anyone who is considered to be a firefighter by the employer, namely the municipality. Let it go at that. Let the municipality devise a way in which it works out who does what. Some of the municipalities are very small. They're not that rich. They might find it better to have someone, a firefighter, yes, but when there's no fire on, have them work down the tax office collecting taxes so there's some money to pay the fire department, you know? But if you did that kind of thing under this bill, you'd be out of order. I think that the other provisions in there about the governor and council having the right to determine the wage levels that would qualify and how far back you had been a firefighter in order to qualify are far too vague. You know, they're absolutely imprecise. They're not the kind of thing that would get you through surveying school or medical school or the teacher's college. They're not. You'd have to give clear answers on your examinations to pass. I know that because I passed. But I couldn't have passed if I had submitted this bill as my final exam answer in economics or whatever. It just wouldn't have gotten me through because there was nothing to it. Now, there's one more thing that they should take out of this bill, in my view, because it is the most horrendous portion of the bill of all, and certainly is the principle of the bill. And that is this business about you can't know if you have cancer or any other disease until after this bill is passed and proclaimed in order to get benefits under this bill. If you know now that you're dying of cancer from having swallowed up too much smoke in a fire, well, that's tough. That's what the bill is saying. If you're a volunteer, doesn't matter. You know, this, appears, and I hope I'm wrong, Mr. Speaker, I'm open to refutation. Just let them produce it. But it appears to me to be a massive denial of fundamental rights to the firefighters of Nova Scotia. And if that is the case, how can they then expect members of the opposition to support the bill and grant it speedy passage?
Good question.
You know, you do that stuff when the legislation is good. I don't think I heard any political party fighting the $155 check. They all hasten to say, yes, we'll pay it too. But with this kind of a bill, you can't give that kind of a response, because the bill does not appear to be on the side of the firefighter. Now, I see the time is getting rather late, Mr. Chairman. I think I've made most of the main points that I'd like to make. Are there any speakers from the government side that want to speak in the bill? Because if so, I'll take my seat right now. The ranks seem to be, well, we could look into many aspects of the bill, Mr. Speaker, and I'm sure that we will in the days that lie ahead. I can't see this bill given the rapid rubber stamp. It just doesn't warrant that, as it's now worded. Now, there's several things the government can do. They could give us a commitment now that they admit that the bill is deficient, but if we would support it on second reading, they would attempt to clean it up in law amendments. That's not a hard thing to do. It only takes about a half a minute of your time, but it takes the courage to make that kind of a commitment. That's point one. The second thing that they could do is stand up here in this debate and explain where I'm wrong. Because they should know me well enough to admit and to know that I'll admit very quickly when I'm wrong. And I've often been wrong over the years. Repeatedly wrong, some may say. Aha, see, yes. But if I'm wrong, tell us where I'm wrong. That's what I ask. If they won't do either, I suppose we'll have to tie up the debate a little longer. You know, and we can do it, and can in the committee of the whole on the law amendments, and also third reading. And there's all those amendments. Remember the reasoned amendment and the referral to a committee, and the hoist, 3 months or 6 months. It has to be one or the other, not both. I think it would be a good idea, yeah, to, not just the Workers' Compensation Board leaders, but the fire marshal. I think the fire marshal, all the government would have to do is say, yes, we'll call the fire marshal down to give us his views on the bill. Before the Law Amendments Committee, not in a secret conclave. You know, if they give us that kind of assurance, I'm not against the firemen.
Order, please. Would the honourable member like to move adjournment debate because of the late hour?
I agree with you, Mr. Speaker, and would move adjournment of second reading.
Motion to adjourn debate. Is it agreed? All those in favour say aye. Contrary minded, nay. The motion is carried. The Honourable Government House Leader in tomorrow's hours and the order of business.
Now rise to meet again tomorrow at the hour of 12 noon. The House will sit until 8 p.m. At the conclusion of question period and 4 hours of supply, we'll move into public bills for second reading, and we will go through the bills in numerical order. Mr. Speaker, with that, I move adjournment.
Motion says the House adjourned till 12 noon tomorrow. Is it agreed? All those in favour say aye. Contrary minded, nay. Motion is carried. The House adjourned till 12 noon tomorrow.